Hi guys, and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be working on a marker piece, which I haven't done in quite a while. And the reason I was inspired to do this is because my amazing friend Carrah did this really cool collaboration with Spectrum Noir markers, and it's a 13-piece set. You're going to get 5 different marker colors, this awesome little set of coloring pages, some paper, as well as a black art liner. So this video isn't sponsored or anything, but Carrah is so amazing, so talented, and she's such a great person. And I just wanted to play around with these markers, and I was just excited to try them and play around with all the colors that she picked. So I will link all her social media down in the description box if you want to check her out. Like I said, she's an amazing marker artist. And along with this, Spectrum Noir also sent me these brush markers, which I actually haven't tried before. So I decided to sit down and do a marker video. And in this marker video, I actually want to talk a little bit more about my process of using markers. So the first thing that I do when I'm going to be working with markers, especially a new set that I don't really know, I'm going to make a whole swatch chart. So I'm going to swatch all of the markers. That's going to give me an idea of not just how juicy they are, because there were a couple in this set of the brush markers that weren't quite as juicy. All of Carrah's were super juicy. And those are going to give me like an idea of which ones might be more juicy, like I said, also kind of the finished colors of them. And I can kind of just have it to reference on hand if I'm looking for a specific color that I think will look good. So I definitely recommend having a swatch or like a swatch paper next to you. Also, you're going to want to have that with you so that you can play around with different color combinations, different blending things before you actually put it on your final piece. So one thing that I really do recommend with markers is really planning things out in advance and kind of like being aware of the colors that you're going to put on so you can always test those out on paper before you go in. So I am starting with the sketch here, and I know a lot of people, I really don't feel like I should sketch on the marker paper because I do a lot of erasing, but I just tend to not really like to transfer things. I do it for watercolor paper, but for marker paper, I find that it can hold up to the erasing a little bit better. So I just drew straight on the marker paper. For marker paper, I do find that the best kind of marker paper is going to be something that is thicker and very smooth. I find that a lot of companies sell marker paper that is very thin, and that really just doesn't work for the style of markers that I do and that a lot of people on YouTube do. You really can't build up a lot of layers or blending or shading. They're kind of more useful for like architectural patterns and designs, fashion stuff, but not so much for finished illustrations. So my go-to kind of paper for this is going to be the Strathmore Smooth Bristol board. I love that. I've been using it forever. I do also like the Express It blending card, but that is a little bit more expensive and a little bit harder to find in kind of stores that are close to me. So that's definitely what I recommend for paper. In terms of the markers that you're going to be using, obviously you want to be using alcohol-based markers, but after that you can really choose whatever markers work for you. So there are so many different brands out there. Like I said, I'm using Spectrum Noir markers, but one thing that I do find to be a lot easier is when the marker does have a brush tip. Obviously this is all personal preference, but I do find a brush tip makes it so much easier for blending. Bullet tips are really, really great for getting in those fine details and establishing areas of kind of shading at the beginning. And then those chisel nibs are great for filling in larger areas like backgrounds. So they do all have a purpose, but personally, I really enjoy having a brush tip. Luckily, most of these markers did have a brush tip, and then Carrah's had these really, really nice bullet points that I said I could also use for a lot of the details, as well as a chisel kind of tip, which was great because I used a lot of her colors in the background and in kind of some larger areas. I like to keep my sketch at least somewhat light because I actually go in over the sketch with the markers and I don't do line art at the very beginning. I will generally add it towards the end after I've defined the shapes and the shading. I find that this gives me a little bit more freedom and flexibility to change things as I go if things aren't looking right once I get the shading in. This allows me to be a little less like stuck by the original drawing and the original line art if I don't like something, it makes it a lot easier to kind of change it at least a little bit. For the sketch that I'm doing right now, I'm using two pencils or so, 2 or 3, and I am using a selection between a very hard pencil, which is going to have a nice lighter line, then a HB pencil, and I think a 2B pencil, which is a little bit more black and defined to really work on those details. But I think I mostly just use the hard pencil and the HB in this. I don't really think I used the darker one very much, if at all. So that's kind of where I started with the sketch. So the next thing that I am working on is the background. I usually start with getting in the flats of the background, just because that is, it's the background, it's the furthest thing in the back, so everything is going to kind of layer on top of it. So that just helps me get all of that in. Also, when you're working with different colors, it's really helpful to kind of color in as much of the white as you can at the beginning. The reason for this is that colors are going to appear different based on the colors that are around them. So a color can appear more vibrant, more dull, etc., depending on the color that's next to it. So if you really want a good idea of what your picture is going to look like, it's really helpful to start putting in some of the colors right at the beginning, especially a strong background color like this cool yellow is. After that, I started with the skin. I like to start with the skin because it generally layers under everything else, and it is my most complex and time-consuming part. I started with a light layer of the very lightest skin tone that I was going to be using. I also left some white layers just to keep those nice and bright. After that, as you saw, I went in with gray. One of the reasons I did this is because markers tend to be more bright and saturated. I find that it can be a little bit harder, especially in the skin tones, to get complex and realistic skin tones. They can frequently turn out much too bright, too orange, too saturated, and that is definitely something that I find can be hard to control in markers. One thing that I find makes that a lot easier to control is doing an underlayer of gray, maybe a grayish purple, blue, depending on whatever colors you're going to be using. That really helps to add in some of that depth and muted colors and tone down some of that bright color. After that, I went over the gray with a slightly darker skin tone just to blend it in and give it some of that skin tone color. So one thing that I really like to do is layer down one color like the gray, layer another color over the top of it to tone it a different way, and back and forth like that, essentially like you're glazing in a painting. After that, I continue to build up all of these different layers. Now, one thing that I really do with my marker technique is I constantly build up layers. I tend to approach it kind of like I would approach a watercolor painting. So I start with this underpainting of the gray and the base colors, and then I slowly build up. I'm building up not just with the skin tone colors that are available, or the traditional Caucasian skin tone colors that are available, I should say, in the packet, and then I start building up on top of that with adding in more complex colors that are going to give that skin more vibrancy and more realism. So some of the colors that I started to add in were obviously that pink more on the nose and the cheeks for that blush, and where the blood is going to kind of come under the skin and create that flush. I also add in some purple. I'm going to add that in underneath the chin, underneath and around the eyes, and in the shadowy areas. I'm going a little bit heavier on the purple in this piece because purple is the complementary color to yellow, which is my main color in the background. So I think that having a slightly stronger purple tint can be useful. Also, I find that when you look at skin, you can see a lot more different colors than you would actually expect. And letting those brighter colors or more unique colors show through a little bit can be really, really helpful in adding realism and depth to the skin. One other color that I added in was yellow. I added this in partially because my background was so yellow and I wanted to create kind of a bit of reflected light and get the overall atmosphere that she was going to be in, because that yellow light would affect her skin tone. But I think it's helpful to put yellow in a skin tone anyway, especially around the jawline and the forehead, kind of the bridge of the nose area. There's a few areas in the skin that tend to lean a little bit more yellow. I continue with that technique of adding in more unique colors and then going over them with more of the skin tone colors to blend everything out and make it look cohesive. I then added in the lips because they are more of a skin tone color. For that, I'm going to go over the lips in more of the pink and peachy color that I want, establishing the shadows. And then I actually went over with the skin tone, and that's going to help them blend more into the skin and look more natural. Then I decided to throw in some of the hair because I felt like that big blank white space was definitely not helping me in terms of the colors of the skin. I really, like I said, do think that you should get rid of white space as quickly as possible, so I decided to go in with the hair. I decided to do the hair in a purple color because, again, it's complementary to the yellow background, and I just thought that would look really nice. I think for hair, it's very important to start by defining blocks of hair and not get too involved in the little details. So I started with the lighter color of the hair and laid out some of those blocks. Then I went in with a slightly darker, more mid-tone shadow color and started defining those areas a little bit more, slowly carving out the darks. After that, I went over the dark with that previous light color. Again, this is going to help me blend those colors all in together and create more unique colors. Then I start building up even more with the darker colors, just layering and layering, mixing in different tones and different colors, and starting to add more and more detail to those strands, as well as blend things out a little bit more. Once I kind of have that base layer, I went in with some various tones of colors, including some pinks and some more peaches. This is going to help me add more dimension to the hair and more depth to the hair because hair generally isn't all just one color. Most people have some varying tones in their hair. Then I went in with some blue to add even more variation and to add that coolness in the shadows. Again, this is more layering just on top of each other. I treat this as if it is a watercolor painting. So going in again with more dark colors and really starting to get in more of that strand-like effect. One thing that I do very frequently during this process is I use a colorless blender. So this specific set didn't come with a colorless blender, so I am using a colorless blender from Art & Fly. And the way that I use that colorless blender is I actually use it not just to blend colors, which I will use it to blend a light color into white. I generally don't use it to blend midtones or darker colors because it can lift. And that is what I normally use it for. I tend to treat my colorless blender as a way to lift the color up the way that I would in watercolor paints. This means I can go back in, lift the color, and add highlights where I need to that are more soft. That's what I'm doing right now at the top of the lip. I laid down that color and then I'm going back in with that colorless blender to add in lighter highlights exactly where I want them. Going back in with a darker marker, I am adding in some line work. Like I said, I tend to add in line work towards the end. One of the biggest reasons for this is not only not kind of constricting myself to the original sketch, but it also allows me to create softer line work that is more integrated with the picture. You don't always need lines along every single portion of your picture, so if you draw it out and color it first, you can make more intelligent and informed decisions about where you want those lines to be and what you want them to define. I also tend to go over my lines a little bit with a slightly lighter but still dark color. What this does is it blurs the lines just a little bit and it kind of allows them to blend into the picture more and stand out a little bit less and be a little bit less stark and jarring. I'm working on the eyes now, and the eyes I take in the kind of same style direction that I do all of them, just doing a lot of layering. So I started with that lightest color, then went in with a mid-tone defining where the pupil was going to be and some of those kind of star-like bursts. And then I went in actually with a lighter color, then using the colorless blender to lift off more of the highlights and adding in a darker tone in a more greenish color instead of a more bluish color. That way I'm going to add more depth and more color variation to the eyes. Once I have the overall tones established and the lights and darks, I'm going in with this bright green to add some more variation again to the color of the eye, and then a lighter green and yellow to lift off some of that highlight and make it nice and bright without actually making it too bright. I'm using a medium dark color to define around the eye line. I find that it's best to use a variety of dark and light colors to define the eye line, both the top and the bottom, as well as around it. That's going to help the eye actually look like it's sitting in the face and not just floating on top of the face. So you can lighten up that line kind of in the center where it's a little bit more curved out and darken it in the corners where the eyeball is going to curve in. After I have all of this stuff set up, I want to go back in and flesh out the background a little bit more, darken and even it up. Once I did that, I knew that I wanted to add a drop shadow to this. I thought it would look really interesting. So something that I found very helpful was to make a swatch and then try out the different colors that I thought about using over the top of it so I could see how they would change and layer before I actually put them on the piece. I really loved this bright pink color that was in Carrah's set, so I decided to layer that over the top. No surprise that it went well with that because both this color and the yellow were from the same set, and she did such a good job in choosing really unique colors that went together really well. Once I had that, I started in on the dress or shirt, whatever it is. I thought blue would work well for this because it would mirror the blue both in her eyes and in the flower in her hair. The light blue marker that I used at first was definitely not quite as juicy as the others, but it's just the base layer, so that's totally fine. Then I went over with a slightly more mid-tone marker and started establishing the shadows. I do the same thing with shadows here as I do in both the skin tone and the hair. I start by establishing the darker, broader shapes, and then I go in adding in more details with darker markers and shades. After that, I go in and add all these different tones of markers, different colors, adding in more green blues and more teals, and that's going to give me, again, that color variation. I'm layering a gray over the top of this shadow here on the left to dull it out, and because I don't want it too dull, I then layered that darker blue back on top. I used the colorless blender to lighten up some of the right side, but it came out a little bit patchy. I think my colorless blender is kind of running out of ink. So then I layered back over the top of it with some different markers that were still light, but to blend that in a little bit. One thing that I love about markers is that you can really fix a lot of your mistakes, kind of similar to watercolor in a way where you can push it into the paper or in watercolor's case, lift it off. Marker, it actually sinks into the paper, and if you look at the back of your paper, it will like bleed out. Then again, you can see me adding in that yellow highlight of the reflected light because your skin, your shirt, your hair is going to be affected by that light that's around you. Layering on top of that, I went in with that bright pink again to create a little border on the top of the shirt. And then I went in and added in eyebrows before I forgot because I definitely forgot about them before. I wanted to darken up some of the shadows in the hair a little bit more because I felt like it was looking a little bit flat in these shadows. It's really important to have variation both in your shadows and your highlights and have a varied range of midtones, lights, and darks. If everything's a little bit too midtone, you're not going to have enough contrast. And I really do find that adding in those little strips of dark in the shadows really does help it look more realistic and gives it more depth. Again, I'm going in with the little line art technique that I am using, which is using a darker marker, again, to go over the edges. I also used the brush tip for this as well as the bullet tip. Then I wanted to fill out the last little white spot on the paper, which was her necklace, and that was pretty simple. I just did a little kind of sunflower style flower in the center. Again, using a very similar technique, really just starting by layering those colors, getting the overall blend of darker in the center, then light, then dark, and then I'm actually going back in and lifting off to create more highlights, then going in and adding those midtones and darker colors to create sharper distinctions between the petals and to make it look a little bit more defined, I guess. I just said defined, but there we go. I also have the beads, which I worked on for a little bit, and the colorless blender was very, very helpful when it came to the beads because I was really able to lift up a different variety of highlights, which is very, very helpful when you're working with something that is very reflective or like glass-like. I basically just layer things until it looks right, and really just focus on adding in all of those different tones and colors. Again, I'm working more on the line art, and I'm making sure to go back over and soften the line art in strategic places. When you're looking at a face, there's definitely going to be lines that are sharper than others, depending on how sharply that area of skin folds or is contrasted to the skin around it. But there's other areas where, while there's still a line and definition, you want it to be a little bit softer, such as the side of the nose or the bottom of the nose, versus like the nostrils, which you want to keep a lot sharper. So going back over with this slightly lighter color can really help blend that line art in. And that's another reason that I don't do the line art until the end. After that, I added in a little bit of eyeshadow, and I find that doing makeup on a character is easiest at the end after you have their skin tone set out because you can kind of layer things over the top. This is going to be different depending on the skin tone of your character and the makeup that they're wearing. Obviously, if you're drawing a character with a darker skin tone who's wearing very bright or light eyeshadow or something like that, that's something that you want to wait to layer. But I do find that especially for blushes and more sheer shadows, it works really, really well to layer them over the skin tone. I wanted to add in some more details, so I used that bullet point to go ahead and add in all of these flowers over the back, layering over the drop shadow. And I also went in and added this textural kind of stripe to the little, I always figure it's like a ribbon embroidery going around her shirt. So this is where I made a mistake, and this is where we can all learn from the things that I have done, which is to double check the pen that you're going to be using before you start using it. It's at this point that I do start using a more defined pen for the eyelashes because those are something that I do really want very crisp and clear. And I did not double check the pen that I was using, and I used the wrong pen. This pen that I used is not alcohol marker proof, and so it smudged like crazy. So I was really not a big fan of the eyelashes at this point, but don't worry, I was able to fix them. After all of the adding in of the black lines and deciding to walk away from that for a moment, I went in with white gouache or white ink. The white that I use is by Dr. P.H. Martin. It is the bleed proof white and a very, very small brush. I went in and added the sharper highlights here, the very tip of the nose, the reflections on her lips, and more reflections around the eye, especially down in the bottom half where you can kind of see the lower waterline. Then, to fix my eyelash mistake, I went over them in white, let that dry, and once I've gone over things in white, I can actually layer marker over the top of them to an extent to tint that color to be a more pastel color. Obviously, I had to add in lots of highlights to the hair, which I did and was very fun, and also added in some more highlights to that necklace. Once everything is added in, I can go and use water to soften some of those edges. And as I mentioned before, I can go back over the white with pen to define certain areas or to change the colors. I wanted pink eyelashes on this girl, so that's what I did. And I had a final touch where I went in and added a little bit of white highlight to those pink lashes as well. So definitely enjoy using a white paint on top because it really allows you to create softer edges and sharper edges where you need them, and you can layer markers on top of them, blend them out, and it's just very, very helpful to add that final touch to your piece. So that is basically my process of how I use alcohol markers. I really hope this was helpful for some of you and you maybe learned something new. I am not a professional marker artist. This is not necessarily my go-to medium, but I do enjoy them, and I think I use them in a little bit of a different way than maybe some people. So I hope this video was valuable to you. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys!